Alright, so we are now on reading 16, Trading with the World. And just as a quick disclaimer, everything that I'm basically saying here is just what the curriculum says. These aren't necessarily my views, and you will see why. Okay, so what's the general point? Agenda. We are going to talk about the argument for international trade. So over and over you will see in this reading that the author, Michael Parkin, and then obviously the CFA Institute that is presenting this reading is making a very strong case for international trade. Talks about what are trade restrictions and why they are bad, and then any argument against international trade, there is a critique for that argument. Okay, so bottom line is that there should be complete free trade, and that is better for everyone, is what this reading is trying to convince you. So what is the argument for international trade? The fundamental force behind international trade is the theory of comparative advantage, which we will understand very well in the next half an hour. A country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if it can produce that good at a lower opportunity cost than any other country. International trade can increase global consumption of all goods and services if countries focus on producing those goods and services in which they have a comparative advantage. Specialization and trade go hand in hand. Fundamental point being, do what you are good at and then trade. Alright. To understand this whole concept of comparative advantage, we are going to use an example from the curriculum where we say there are two countries, one called farmland and another called mobilia. And for simplicity, both these countries just produce two things. They produce cars and they produce grain. First, we will look at the production possibilities frontier for farmland, which, as you might imagine, is better or more efficient at producing grain. So a production possibilities frontier, in case you have not seen this before, is saying that okay, this country can produce two things. If it puts all its energy in producing grain, then it will produce only grain. So the y-axis is grain, x-axis is cars. So if all the productive resources of the country are used to produce grain, it will produce 36 units of grain, and each unit of grain is defined as 1 unit is 1 billion bushels per year. So effectively we are saying if it only produces grain, it will produce 36 billion bushels of grain. But people can't survive on grain alone. They need to go from place to place, so they need cars. But to produce cars, they need to produce less grain. So as we produce less grain in farmland, we can start making cars. And given the need for grain and the need for cars in farmland, they are at this point A, where this country without any trade produces 15 billion bushels of grain, and they produce 8 million cars a year. So this is where they currently are. Now, when we look at a production possibilities frontier for this country, we also need to understand this concept of the slope, which is the opportunity cost of a car. So if we say that the opportunity cost of one car is 9,000 bushels of grain, that means that they cannot, if they produce 9,000 bushels less, that same resource can be used in making a car. So if the currency is bushels of grain, then the cost or the opportunity cost of one car is 9,000 bushels, and that effectively is the slope of this production possibilities frontier. I'm not, if you really want, you can later look at this basic mathematics, but I hope this is apparent that the opportunity cost of one car is 9,000 bushels of grain. So in this simplistic world, what's the currency? It's grain. Okay. Yeah, it varies, but at this point A, it's this, and that point is the point where they currently are in a world where they cannot trade. Okay, they need grain, they need cars, and they are at this point. So they need 15 billion bushels of grain, and they need 8 million cars. So remember this. So remember the 8 million cars and 15 billion bushels of grain. That's the point where farmland is at without any trade. Now the other country in the world is Mobilia. So as you might imagine, they are better at mobile solutions, which in this case is cars. Okay, so they get around more easily. Why? Because for them producing cars is easier. If they put all their energy into grain, they would be at this point something like 22 billion bushels of grain, and if they produce all cars, they are here. But given their needs, they are at this point a complement, which is 18 billion bushels of grain to feed their population and 4 million cars to drive around in. So they are at 4,18. What is their opportunity cost? Notice that this line is not as steep as what we just saw. So the opportunity cost of one car is only 1,000 bushels of grain. So what is their specialization? What's Mobilia better at? So they are better. Mobilia is better at cars. Farmland is better at producing grain. So just off the top of our heads, we can probably imagine that both countries can be better off if Mobilia makes the cars and exports to farmland, and farmland produces grain and exports to Mobilia, and basically the two countries trade cars for grain. Okay, and we are just going to quantify that and show the effect. So everybody is clear. When we say comparative advantage, which country has the comparative advantage in cars? So Mobilia has the comparative advantage in cars, and farmland has the comparative advantage in producing grain.
But this is comparative advantage compared to their own costs.
Yeah.
Not cost of the. It may happen, like for example China, that it might be better at.
Yeah. So this is like what economists do, just taking two countries, two products. So in between the two countries, Mobilia has the comparative advantage in cars compared to the other country. Okay. Now let's look at the international market for cars and take it from a farmland perspective. Okay, I think what we are going to head towards here very briefly is that from farmland's perspective it makes more sense, since they are good at making grain, not so good at making cars. What we are going to show is that it makes sense for them to produce more grain and then use that grain to buy cars. So if we look at the international market for cars and look at it from farmland's perspective, let's look at first the demand for cars in farmland. What was the cost of cars, or the opportunity cost for cars in farmland? If you recall, that was 9,000. Okay, so if they are sold a car for 9,000 bushels or more, would they buy any cars? What would the demand for cars be? Zero. Okay, because their own cost is 9,000. So if somebody sells them a car for 10,000, the demand will be zero. Obviously, as the price of cars comes down, measured in terms of how many bushels of grain to buy cars, we have a downward sloping. So this is our demand for cars. So we have, as always, a downward sloping demand curve. So we don't need to go into the details, but you understand this point and you understand that the demand curve is going to be downward sloping. Now what about supply? Where is the supply coming from? So let's say that from Mobilia's perspective, they are willing. So what was their opportunity cost? 1,000. So as long as they can get more than 1,000 bushels of grain, they are willing to supply. So at less than that, they will not supply. So that explains this point, and that also explains the upward sloping supply cars. So that's Mobilia supply, which in our international market is their export of cars. So let's say that given this supply and demand, that's the equilibrium point, where the equilibrium point is quantity of 4 million cars. And what does this 3 represent? Remember, in supply demand, what's the y-axis? That's price. The price of one car or the price of 4? No. In supply and demand, this is the price of 1 unit. Okay, whenever we talk price on the y-axis, that's the price of. So as long as, so both these countries are happy, so Mobilia would be happy selling 4 cars where each car has a price of 3,000 bushels. Okay, so that means that essentially from farmland's perspective, farmland is willing to give per car 3,000 bushels. So for 4 cars, how much is farmland willing to give?
12,000.
So farmland is willing to give 12,000 bushels for 4 cars. Opportunity for trade. So let's now see what this does to our production frontier. We are doing this all from farmland's perspective, and obviously you can do the same thing for Mobilia. So farmland will now be giving grain and getting cars. It's good at producing grain. So on its production possibility frontier, where earlier it was here at point A, what can it do? Obviously from its own production perspective, it's constrained in that it has to be on this production frontier. So will it move up or down? It will move up. Why? Because it has a comparative advantage in grain. So it is going to produce more grain. So it comes to this point B, where it is now producing more grain and less cars. So if it comes to this point where it is producing now 30 units of grain and 5 units of cars, remember it's going to give away 12 units of grain for 4 cars. So if it produces 30 and gives away 12, how much grain does it have left for its own consumption? So it comes to this point 18. And how many cars will it have? So at this point, how many cars does it produce? 5. But how many cars is it getting for those 18?
4.
Yeah, so it is getting 4 more cars. So from 5 we go to this point 9. So notice that through trade they manage to go outside their production frontier, so they are better off. And this essentially is the heart and soul of the argument for free trade, where if you focus on what you are good at, then you can be better off. Now unfortunately for us as a country, we don't know what we are good at. So I don't know where we go with this, but anyway, that's a separate problem that we need to solve. Okay, so I hope everybody gets this. This is one of the most important economic concepts, and a concept that is used over and over to explain why free trade is good for you.
I have a question. If farmland is good at cars, why don't they?
No, they're not good at cars.
Sorry, bushels, grain. Why don't they only produce cars of grain?
Because
they have even producing like 5 cars themselves, they sort of
actually the point, so to be very honest, we can discuss this later. We don't really need to get into the details, but a simplistic answer is it's because of this curve. It's not like as in the rate of substitution or the opportunity cost changes as you move along the curve, and based on all the supply demand interaction and the supply demand that we looked at the last time, this was the optimal amount. But I doubt that on the exam there will be something overly quantitative here. The key fundamental point is that comparative advantage dictates that you focus on what you are good at, focus on what you specialize in, and then trade. So a country like Saudi Arabia is good at only one thing, which is oil. So they should just do oil and then use that money to then invest elsewhere. Okay, now let's talk about, so if trade is so good for everyone, then there should be no restrictions, no trade restrictions. But do we have trade restrictions in the world? We sure do. So we need to understand what they are, why they are, and who benefits from them. So broadly speaking, there are 2 main tools to protect domestic industries from international competition. So those tools broadly are tariffs, and then we also have non-tariff barriers. So let's understand these. What's a tariff? It's simply a fancy term for a tax which is imposed by governments to make imported goods and services more expensive relative to their domestic production, ostensibly often to promote local industry. Okay, so what is the impact of tariffs? Higher prices of commodities. So if you could get things cheaper from abroad, but the government is putting tariffs, so that means when you import, things become more expensive. Lower trade volumes. Obviously, if you impose tariffs, then there will be less trade. The good thing for the government is that it's revenue when they impose tariff, unlike imposing taxes on your own population, which is a hard thing to do. Tariffs on products that come in and out of the country are much easier to track, so this is much easier to it's much easier to collect tariff revenue than it is to collect tax from your own citizens. On the negative side, there is inefficiency, which we'll show, because there are lower gains from trade if you impose tariffs. So what's a graphical example? Let's say that in farmland, the car lobby says that, look, we want to develop a car industry, so there should be a tariff, a tax imposed on any cars that we import. Okay, so that is, again, this is from the farmland perspective. So that means the demand curve for cars in farmland still remains the same. But what happens to the supply of cars coming in from the international market? The supply moves left or up. So at a given quantity, the price now is much more. How much more? It's more by the tariff amount. So if initially we were at this point 4 units of cars and at a price of 3, then from this point A, once our supply curve shifts, we move to point B, where we have a smaller quantity. So people in farmland have fewer cars and they are paying much more. So they are paying 6, but who is benefiting? So this whole amount is going to the government. So there is dead weight loss, but it's easy revenue for the government. What are non-tariff barriers? Broadly speaking, there are 2 types of non-tariff barriers. They are quotas and then voluntary export restraints. So quotas are quantitative restriction on the import of a particular good, which specifies the maximum amount of the good that can be imported in a given period of time. So generally quotas are more prevalent in textiles and agriculture. So basically what you need to remember is quota is a restriction on how much you can import. And then, not as common but they still exist, voluntary export restraints are agreements between 2 governments in which the governments of exporting countries agree to restrain the volume of its own exports, and these exist between a few countries such as US, Japan, US, China. Okay, so now who benefits from these tariffs? So on these restrictions, tariff is obvious. The big beneficiary is the government of the importing country. So in the example that I just gave, who benefited? So it's the government of farmland that benefits. When we have a quota system, then the importer benefits. So if we have a textile lobby in Pakistan that's trying to put a quota on how much textile can be imported, the benefit goes to the textile industry, because then they can charge a higher price for the product that they are producing. When you have a voluntary export restraint, then the beneficiary is the foreign exporter. So what are the arguments for protectionism? There are 3 main arguments. One is the national security argument, infant industry argument, dumping argument, and then there are several other smaller arguments. So we are going to just go through these in order. Okay. So what is the national security argument? The argument is that a country must protect industries producing defense equipment and their raw material and other intermediate inputs. So you are saying, okay, this industry is important in case we get into some sort of a war, and this industry is not under our control, we'll be in a lot of problem. Okay, so let's say our defense industry or our airline industry needs to be completely protected. What's the counter argument? So this is an argument for international isolation. In war times, every industry contributes to national defense. So the person with the counter argument will say, okay, then you'll have to sort of isolate every industry. So what the author here recommends is that for strategic industries, rather than doing protectionism, the government should give some subsidy to that industry so that the quantity produced is still high, and through free trade the prices will remain at world market levels. Another one that I think is more common is this infant industry argument, where the argument is that, okay, the automotive industry in our country is in its early phase, so let's protect this industry so that it grows. Okay, so protect industry until maturity, dynamic comparative advantage, or learning by doing. So we'll get a comparative advantage once we made enough cars. Okay, this is valid only if the benefit of learning by doing accrue not only to the owners and workers, but spillover effect to other industries and the economy in general. Okay, so this is an argument, but it should not be that the only beneficiary is the owners of that industry. And again, the suggestion is that if you must do some regulation, then a direct subsidy is better than trade protection. Okay, then there is a dumping argument. How many people know what dumping means? So dumping means where you claim that China or whatever other country is sending material to your country and selling at artificially low prices and hurting your domestic market. So that's the argument, and hence the players in the domestic market will argue that let's impose tariffs because the foreigners are illegally selling at below their cost in order to wipe out our business. Okay, so this argument is firms may dump, which means sell below cost, to achieve a global monopoly, and to counteract that we should put duties on the foreign companies. But it's the counter argument is that it's very difficult to detect dumping. Why? Because exporters' price in domestic market is normally taken as a benchmark for whether dumping is happening or not. But the supply demand dynamics in the exporters' country and in our country might be very different. So they might be setting a price based on the supply demand curves in their country. So we can't just take that price and say, okay, why is the price in our country lower? And also, it's very hard to imagine natural monopolies. So it is always going to be that alternate foreign suppliers might still come in. So if China is trying to sell something cheap in a way that benefits our consumers because they are getting lower stuff, so if we think that they are trying to become a global monopoly, that's extremely hard because companies from other countries can also come in. So you might have some company from Taiwan that might come in with lower cost products. So very hard to detect, very hard to prove. Okay, another huge one. Now these are other arguments that we don't see in our country, but we will see in a place like the US. So saving jobs. What's the argument? The argument might be that we do not want to import cheap cars from Mexico so that we encourage our own industry here in the US. Okay, so they say that trade with Mexico might, this is from a US perspective, might cause job losses. Automobiles might not be such a great example, but nevertheless, this was a huge issue in the early 90s. So the point is, so that's the argument, that let's put restrictions on material from Mexico to maintain jobs in the US. So the counter argument is that jobs might be destroyed in some sectors but then they will be created in other sectors, and it is possible that more jobs are created in other sectors than are destroyed. For example, when you are doing more imports, then there are jobs created in the retailing and distribution sector. Okay. Another argument is competition with cheap foreign labor. So the argument is jobs shift from developed to developing countries. Okay. The idea here is that this is again from a US perspective, where they say that okay, in those in countries like Mexico, labor is much cheaper, so they can make things at a lower cost. Again, it's related to jobs going out. What's the counter argument? Low wage workers generally have lower productivity. However, productivity is higher in industries where a company has comparative advantage. So here the counter argument is that every country should just focus on what it does better. So focus on its comparative advantage rather than trying to impose restrictions. Just a couple more and then we are done. So another is brings diversity and stability. So the argument is that if a given country such as Saudi Arabia only has one real product, oil and oil related stuff, so there might be an argument to diversify into other industries. But the counter argument is that rather than being inefficient, so Saudi Arabia trying to produce cars which probably nobody would really want to buy, it is better that they do what they are good at, and then from that money they then diversify, they buy whatever else they want to buy. So countries producing one or fewer goods or few goods can also diversify by investing in other countries, which is what Saudi Arabia does. Finally, penalize lax environmental standards. The point here is that rich countries might say that poorer countries have weaker environmental standards and therefore their cost of production is lower. And since their cost of production is lower because of weak environmental standards, we should impose tariffs on the material that we get from them. So argument is poor countries have weaker environmental standards and hence lower costs, so we should impose taxes or tariffs on material that comes in. The counter argument is not all poorer countries have lower environmental standards. Poor countries can then, but assuming they do, poor countries can, so for example, if the United States allows countries like India and Pakistan and so on to produce material and sell to the US, then our economies can improve, and if our economies can improve, then we can also have higher environmental standards. And another point which might sound dirty to us, but from a US perspective, it is that okay, by doing the dirty work in poor countries, we allow the other richer countries to achieve higher environmental standards. Again, I said I'm not making this up, I'm just reproducing material for the curriculum, but there is a point to be made here. So let the poor countries do the dirty work and we can maintain high environmental standards. I think this is the last slide. So protect national culture. So do not allow any Bollywood and Hollywood movies in Pakistan. So let us just make our own art. Okay, so that's the argument. So protection against any sort of cultural invasion. So the argument is free trade in books, magazines, etc. destroy our local culture. But the counter argument is that the foreign influence actually might help ensure the survival of our local talent. So I'm not a big fan of this, but maybe foreign influence coming into our country is developing our talent. Whether we like that happening or not, one can debate, but it does seem to happen. Okay. And the last argument is that protection prevents rich countries' exploitation of developing countries. So if a rich country says that in Bangladesh we have too much child labor, so we do not want to import goods from Bangladesh because they don't have any child labor laws. You have 8-year-old girls that are weaving carpets, so we will not trade with Bangladesh. What does that do to the poverty level in Bangladesh? makes it even worse. Okay, so if the argument is international trade fosters slave and child labor, so we won't do business with that country, that's actually making things worse. By increasing demand for goods from a developing country, we actually increase wages and create more opportunities and jobs in that country. Then why do trade restrictions still exist? There are two main reasons. One is tariff revenues and the other is rent seeking. What are tariff revenues? So for governments with weak internal tax collection system, taxes on international trade, which is reasonably well documented, is a major source of fiscal revenue. We can relate to this very well. Okay, so this is a major reason. Another is rent seeking, which I think we can also understand. Free trade brings benefits to some while imposing costs on others, although the total benefit exceeds costs. So I'll say read the other one and then just explain. So both gainers and losers will lobby for or against free trade. However, anti-free trade groups will undertake larger quantity of lobbying. The larger point here is that, let's take the textile industry again. They have a much higher vested interest in lobbying for, say, import restrictions, okay, versus the masses that might suffer in the process, but the masses don't get easily organized on this issue. So the industries or the entities that have the largest interest are most likely to be more organized and spend more money on lobbying the government and getting their way. So that is what are they essentially doing then? They are rent seeking. So those are the two main reasons why restrictions still exist. So the conclusion, again in this reading there are just three learning objectives. Explain comparative advantage. So can we all do that now? Okay, and how countries can gain from international trade. So we went through that whole example on mobilia and farmland. So we covered that. We talked about tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, quotas and voluntary export restraints. This is simply a compare. It's not asking us to get into too much detail. And finally, evaluate the argument for trade restrictions, which we've looked at about 15 arguments. And what's our bottom line evaluation? That none of those arguments are very strong. Okay.